Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Bianca Durrani, President and CEO of Aperio Philanthropy. Aperio is a full-service nonprofit consulting firm created by a group of fundraisers who wanted to make fundraising simpler, faster, and smarter. We support organizations nationwide with strategic advisory, hands-on support, and embedded partnership. As a firm created to drive change, we could not be more excited to kick off this event series with New York University, focusing on the question of how philanthropy can drive change. What role can we all play in creating the kind of society that we want to live in? Today's first session is focused on how philanthropy can strengthen democracy. And it's my pleasure to turn it over to Michelle D'Amico, who will introduce our moderator and give you an overview of today's event. Thanks for being here.
Great. Thanks so much, Bianca. Hi, everyone. My name is Michelle D'Amico, and I'm the Director of Continuing Education and Public Programs at the NYU SPS Center for Global Affairs, or CGA. Since its founding, our goal at CGA has been to prepare global citizens to make a positive impact in the world. We do this through a variety of activities, including our 2 graduate programs, one in global affairs and another MS in global security, conflict, and cybercrime. We also offer a wide variety of skills and knowledge-based continuing education courses and offer public events such as this that expand upon the critical topics covered in our classrooms. We are very proud to be home to the George H. Hayman Jr. Program for Philanthropy and Fundraising. Through our open enrollment courses in Certificate in Fundraising and Certificate in Digital Fundraising programs, we offer professionally oriented educational options for those looking to enter or grow within the fundraising field. Courses are taught by practitioner faculty who bring their vast experience, expertise, and networks to the classroom. We'll send a follow-up message to all attendees, so please feel free to reach out with any questions you may have about these programs. Additionally, we've reserved some time at the end of today's events for questions from the audience, so please feel free to submit your questions via the Q&A tool. And now I'd like to introduce today's moderator, Dr. Raymond Smith. Dr. Smith is an adjunct associate professor with the NYU School of Professional Studies. Here at the CGA, he teaches a comparative politics course called America in the World, a course on global gender, and one on writing op-eds and blog posts. In addition to his 2 decades of teaching, he's also the author of several books. During his time as a senior fellow with the Progressive Policy Institute, a think tank in Washington, D.C., Professor Smith contributed political commentary for publications including Political, The Daily Beast, The Washington Post, The Hill, and The New York Times. And now, without further ado, I'd like to turn this over to Professor Smith for today's conversation. The virtual floor is all yours.
Well, thanks very much. It's great to be here, Michelle and Bianca. Thank you for this invitation on this important subject, because today it's incredibly timely that we're going to be talking about how philanthropy can strengthen our democracy, an issue I think everyone I know is talking about democracy in one way or another. It's top of the mind for people, and it's across the political spectrum: Republicans, Democrats, liberals, conservatives, independents, everyone in between. People are talking about, what kind of a society we want to live in, and what are the institutions and the systems and the processes we need to get there. And this feeling of crisis that we've had on many levels in recent years has shifted our focus in many ways away from the immediate politics necessarily, or not only focusing on just the next electoral cycle, but to our political system itself. And so today's really distinguished panel is going to address the question of what role can all of us play in driving positive change. And in particular, we'll explore how philanthropic individuals, foundations, and companies are approaching a reimagining of a healthy American democracy that we really can't take for granted anymore, if we ever could. And in particular, given the nonprofit leaders and fundraisers in our audience, we'll also touch on how you can engage a diverse and dynamic base of philanthropists in your work in this area. And so to begin with, it's my pleasure to introduce the members of our panel. Let me begin with Steve Choi, who is the Executive Director at One for Democracy, an organization which asks individuals and foundations to contribute at least 1% of their net worth towards the protection and improvement of our democracy. Steve is a civil rights lawyer, advocate, organizer, and grassroots movement leader who led the New York Immigration Coalition prior to joining One for Democracy. Alexandra Reed Givens is president and CEO of the Center for Democracy and Technology. And in that role, she advocates for using technology to increase equality, amplify voices, and promote human rights. She specializes in the intersection of technology, law, and public policy, particularly with issues regarding privacy, algorithmic fairness, competition, and online speech. We'll also be joined on the panel by Joe Goldman, who's the president of Democracy Fund, which is an independent foundation that champions the leaders who defend American democracy and challenge our political system to be more open and just. As the foundation's president, Joe's an advocate within philanthropy for creating a more effective and powerful field to ensure that our democracy is worthy of the trust of the American people. And we'll also have on the panel Anne Snuku-Gronia, who is the Chief Development Officer at Issue One, a bipartisan organization that aims to build a democracy that works for everyone. Anne is a strategic development professional who specializes in creating diverse revenue portfolios that include government, corporate, foundation, and individual sources. So with that welcome, I think we can ask the panelists to turn on their cameras. And maybe we'll start with a quick round robin. We'll ask everyone, for all of you to get started. Let's ground our conversation in the unique perspectives that you each bring. And so let's get right to the heart of the matter and say, what do you see as the burning question at the heart of this conversation about the role of philanthropy in strengthening our democracy? And maybe we can ask Alexandra to start.
Sure, thank you. First of all, thank you so much for having me. This is a great conversation. And I'll note now that I unfortunately have to jump off the call a little early, so it is not anything anyone has said. I just have another commitment right at 2. So not surprisingly from my perch at the Center for Democracy and Technology, I focus the most on how technology is transforming democracy, which can be both a really positive story in terms of opening up new tools for organizing and democratic discourse, but of course can be a deeply troubling one as well. I think historically, one of the key issues that many philanthropists and organizations were focused on were issues of election security. But increasingly, the dialogue has had to expand to questions of election integrity. From a technical perspective, the 2020 election was one of the most secure in our nation's history, but you still have a large percentage of the populace discrediting the results. So what does that mean? How do we counter politicized efforts to sow distrust in public elections? In the run-up to election, how do we counter mis and disinformation so that voters have accurate, reliable information about the issues at stake? And then I'll say there are also some other core democracy questions around how the internet serves as a field for civic dialogue in general. The internet has democratized communications in powerful ways. You can think about new movements like Black Lives Matter or Me Too, but it's also fragmented discourse and given a megaphone to disinformation, to hate speech, to echo chambers. And so we need many, many minds focusing on these questions at all levels, from the policy level to the grassroots organizing level. And we need more resources to do that work at this critical time.
Great, well, thanks, Alex. That's a great way for us to launch. Joe, how about you? What would you think about this burning question at the center of the discussion?
Yeah, I mean, thanks. I guess I'd back up to say, like, look, the story of American democracy from the beginning has been one about kind of striving to live up to our founding ideals, right? We started from a place in which our democracy was guaranteed only to white male property owners. And we've made remarkable progress over the past 250 years. But we are facing a faction in our politics that is actively opposed to the idea of an inclusive multiracial democracy and is willing to tear down the system in order to protect its power. And this faction is taking advantage of distrust in our institutions, barriers to majority rule, and our corrupted information environment to undermine the system. And at the end of the day, our democracy is remarkably fragile right now. And there's a risk that damage can be done over the next decade that would take generations to recover from. So, as the president of a foundation that is committed to the idea of an inclusive multiracial democracy, I think we're in very dangerous territory right now. And, everything that philanthropy cares about is endangered by the fragility of our democracy. And I think it is incumbent upon philanthropists to join the fight, step up and do their part to strengthen our political system.
Joe, thanks so much for that big picture and those words of warning. Steve, how would you address that question?
Great, thank you. I want to echo a lot of what Joe said. I mean, we're at a moment now with democracy where it is legitimately under threat, where the democracy that we might be in, or the political system we might be in years from now might not actually resemble anything what we have right now. But I also feel like I bring a unique perspective because, you know, up till about a year ago, I was running an advocacy organization. So I come to this work, this intersection between philanthropy and democracy, knowing what the challenges are on the other side. And dare I say that the world of democracy philanthropy was already broken even before the events of January 6th and what you're seeing here. When I was running an advocacy organization, I saw this huge fragmentation that was taking place in the field of democracy philanthropy. Because as an advocacy organization, we're running advocacy campaigns on the C3 side, on the C4 side, holding elected officials accountable. And through a 527 and a PAC, we're endorsing and supporting electeds as well. But the end result of democracy philanthropy was that there are C3 donors who say, we're going to support organizations. We don't want to touch politics. There's political donors who think just in terms of elections and candidates, and they're not thinking about the connection to organizations and campaigns. So the end result is you have funding for advocacy campaigns. You have very little resources for this donut hole in the middle for the C4 and political work that actually makes campaigns successful. And then from the election, from the political side, money comes and booms during election years, and then it busts in non-election years, all of which creates this tremendous fragmentation that keeps democracy philanthropy from being anywhere near as effective as we actually need it to be. So beyond just simply the urgency of the moment, how do we fix this kind of fragmentation that we are seeing in democracy philanthropy and really figure out how to make impact on a larger level? I think that's a question that I've had even before I joined for One for Democracy, and now I'm actually excited to try to solve.
Thank you for those big picture perspectives, Steve. And Anne, how about you? What's your angle on this?
Yeah, I mean, of course, I come at this with the perspective of a fundraiser, and much like Stephen, I'm thinking about how to raise the money to do the work that we are doing, the important work we're doing, and similar themes about the boom and bust cycle, and how to inspire donors really to move into thinking about scaling up this sector. We would really like to see more donors move away from this boom and bust election cycle kind of funding into investing more in structural reform. There are obviously lots of innovative solutions out there, but our sector is just incredibly tiny. So one data point is in 2020, we saw the most charitable giving in the country ever at $471 billion. But if you take our sector, we only received 1.8 billion of those dollars. So that's only 0.3% of all charitable giving to this issue, which is obviously insufficient for the scale of the problems that we're dealing with.
Well, thank you, Anne, and thank you to all the panelists. And that really leads us directly into the questions that we want to ask. And we'll start with looking at trends on the nonprofit side, and in particular, Alexandra and Anne. And let me start with you, Alexandra. You lead an organization on the front lines of efforts to strengthen our democracy. What's been your experience in engaging philanthropists in your work, and what are the opportunities in particular that you're seeing, and also what are the challenges you're facing?
I think we've started to tease out a couple of these issues already. I mean, we do see an increasing number of people wanting to fund in this space, but to Anne's point, the numbers are really low and not nearly recognizing or matched to the scale of the issue, or to Joe's point, just how foundational it is to shore up our democracy to be able to further the other goals that we need to advance in our society. So I think, a couple things that come to mind for me. One is that it's a challenge to communicate to people exactly what the impact of their dollars are going to be. This isn't a field where you can say your $10 will get you X. And that makes it challenging in terms of spurring grassroots participation, having people really connect to the impact. The other piece is having people realize the long-term nature of this work. And a couple other people have touched on this already. People do often fall into the trap of thinking this work needs to happen in an election year. You know, in spring of 2020 or in the spring of 2022, you suddenly start getting phone calls of people saying, I want to support you now. That's always very welcome. But for organizations like mine that are focused on long-term policy interventions, resources for election officials, working with or pressuring companies about how they can be better actors in the information ecosystem and its impact on democracy. That's long-term work. That takes years and years. And you need to be able to do it, investing the resources, knowing that this isn't a quick hit, but we are staffing up to carry on this work for a multi-year campaign. And so I think the more we can do to educate donors about the importance of what's at stake and the long-term nature of this work, the better. I think the one other thing I'll say is that there are really important groups doing this work on the ground. So for example, combating misinformation, targeting a particular population in a particular region in the run-up to an election. Those efforts really matter, right? The research shows that people look to their more local sources for information, that we need to build up massive gaps in the system to shore up trust. So you need a combination of thinking about what the national strategies are, you know, organizations like mine that try to think about the big picture and think about resources that are useful to everyone. And then at the grassroots level too, for doing a lot of that work in practice. And so we need to make sure that it's easy for funders to find those different types of actors in the ecosystem. And just a quick plug for co-panelists here. I mean, this is why One for Democracy is so exciting. And also the role that Democracy Fund and others try to do, helping educate philanthropists about how to put their dollars to work. And I think there's a lot more we can do in that space to be connecting people so they know how they can contribute to the important efforts that are taking place.
Fantastic, some great insights. And Anne, would you say that you finding the same thing or other things you'd like to add?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that Alexandra and I must have written the exact same set of notes for this, because I was going to speak to the complexity and the need for donor education on the issues that we work on. They are so, you know, the need is so great and so varied when it comes to supporting efforts to fight mis and disinformation and choices like ranked choice voting and structural reforms like that. I mean, there's just so much to think about and to invest your dollars in. And exactly what Alex said about the long-term piece, it's hard to educate your donors about the need for their money and the urgent need for their support, but also not discourage them with the facts that it's going to take a very long time to achieve what we wish to achieve. So it's a real balance. And I have sympathy for the donors who are trying to navigate this.
Thank you. We'll turn in a moment to the funder and advisor side with Steve and Joe, but Alexandra, was there anything else you wanted to add? Because I know we will be losing you at some point during this. Anything else? You know, is there any particular, for instance, any one thing you wish the philanthropists knew about making an impact in this space?
Well, this is where I make my standard plug to all donors. I think there's been a really important move in philanthropy recently to focus on multi-year giving, to focus on general operating support and the types of grant giving that recognize that people need to keep the lights on, not just do the sexy work that's described in the brief that they send to you. And so that is a perennial urge to foundations to continue moving in that direction and to really create that relationship with their partners. I think particularly in this space, it's critical because we're in the business of institution building. In what is a relatively small field, we need more nonprofits that can come into this space and then do the work for the long term. And quick hits of money are always welcome, but they don't really do that job. We need people to feel like they're going to be resourced and supported to be maintaining these campaigns over years. And so the more that donors can think about that and try to organize their giving in that manner, it really does help with the long-term infrastructure challenges that we're facing in the democracy field in general.
Well, thank you. And, you know, as we turn to the funder and advisor side, Steve, in light of what Alex and Anna just said, let me ask you about your organization, which asks individuals and foundations to pledge 1% of their net worth to the protection and improvement of our democracy. And how do you make the case for investment for this cause among all the worthy causes that need funding?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I mean, let's face it, so many issues, it feels like the house is on fire, whether you're talking about climate justice, where sometimes the House literally feels like it's on fire, or criminal justice or immigrant rights. There are so many pressing issues. And one of our key arguments that we use, and this is something I actually feel very deeply, is that if you care about any of those issues, whether it's immigrant rights or criminal justice or climate, it doesn't matter. We all need to be democracy activists right now. There's just simply no way we will have success on any of those issues if we don't have a strong and functioning democracy. I was talking earlier this morning with a donor who's a big immigrant rights supporter, and I said, look what happened to immigration reform and the issue of immigrant rights on the federal level. Just like on so many other issues, it's not going anywhere because we do not have a strong and functioning, healthy American democracy. Even despite the fact that there are huge majorities of the American population that support immigration reform, you are not going to see anything like that coming out of our broken political system. We've got to fix that system first if you want to see that kind of change happen. And I feel like that has resonated with people. People have been like, I get it, right? We all need to be democracy activists and democracy donors and supporters right now at this moment. So I think that's been a really strong argument for folks. Another thing is, the other case that we've been able to make is actually kind of a little bit born out of the fragmentation I mentioned earlier. Many of our prospective donors say, okay, I am down to save democracy. I get it. I have no idea where to start, and I'm overwhelmed by choice. I can support Democratic secretaries of state. I can support litigation. I can support so many different things. And our value add there, and I feel like this has been something really interesting and a unique innovation, is we tell people, and we say, first of all, don't give us any money. There was a question in there, right? We say, don't write a check to One for Democracy. Don't do that. It's actually much harder for us to be able to handle that. But we want to be your thought partner and provide the resources necessary, whether it's finding a community of other donors to help you scale your investment, or whether it's a panel of experts who can give you expert recommendations to make it easy as possible to give to democracy. And I think that's been something that a lot of donors and pledgers as part of our community have really reacted to and said, okay, this is really helpful for me, whether they've been individuals or foundations. There've been a lot of different kinds of folks who've been very responsive to that.
Great, thank you. And so then, Joe, let's, as we get this big picture, you've got a dual role and a dual view in that your organization is both a funder and a resource for funders. And with that broad perspective of the field, what are the trends that you're seeing that are most significant?
Yeah, look, I would echo many of the things that have already been said. The really good news is that philanthropy is paying attention to these issues in a way that never was the case in the past. When I've been in this field for my whole career, and within the philanthropy side of it for about a decade, a little bit more. And when it used to be that I would tell people what I did for a living, the response was kind of like, it was a little condescending, right? It was kind of, oh, that's cute. You're trying to make our democracy work better. I'm going to go build houses for the homeless, or something, right? And now philanthropy understands that there's a crisis. And I think as Steve was saying, the problem that is limiting philanthropy's entrance into the space is not a recognition of the problem. It is an understanding of the solutions and a sense of what it means to be impactful. I think people are so overwhelmed by the scale of the problem, the complexity of the solutions, and they're really just looking to find a way to kind of chart their role in the space. And I think what all of us on this panel are trying to do is create the resources and the tools to help them come in.
So in your own work, then, how do you prioritize? Is there an order or a scaffolding of issues that you have in mind about how to address these big picture concerns?
Yeah, I guess, so look, we take a systems view of things, which starts in kind of complexity theory, right? The idea is there aren't any silver bullets. There aren't kind of simple things that can be done that just solves the problem. It's not like if we just funded civic education or redistricting reform or campaign finance reform that the problems go away. We've got a complex system with deeply embedded incentives that are driving behavior. And so we need to kind of look hard at this complex system and try to find leverage within it. We try to take an approach that looks at both the short and the long term, right? If we don't focus on the short term, we worry that there's going to be irreparable damage created that will mean that, you know, we're not going to be able to make any kind of progress over the long term because we've already lost. But if we only focus on the short term, we're not going to solve the problems, right? Because these are big things that, as Alexandra said, you know, take a long time to fix. You know, we tend to break the problem up into two broad areas, right? There's the institutions of our democracy, right? Our election system, our legislative process, judicial system, right? What are the things that we can do to be impactful there? And then we also think about kind of movement and media, right? Outside of formal government, how do we help traditionally, historically marginalized groups build power? How do we address the corruption of our information system? How do we think about the role that the social media platforms play, right? So we try to look across all of those areas and then think about, you know, where really are the leveraged opportunities across them, and where can we uniquely be impactful? You know, there is more than enough broken democracy to go around. And I think whether a donor is interested much more in kind of nonpartisan issues of journalism or information or civic participation, that's great. If they want to really dig into the more partisan side of things, there's plenty of work to do there as well.
Good. Well, thanks for that. And maybe we'll turn in a minute to practical tips for fundraisers. But still, since we still have Alex here, is there anything else you wanted to add before you will be moving on?
I'm not here. I was just happy to hear the answers and the good advice coming from different panelists. So thank you.
Okay, great. So I think that, you know, we're seeing this as a huge, intractable, maybe generation-long, complex issue. Let's maybe turn to practical tips for fundraisers. And, you know, what advice would you have for nonprofit leaders and fundraisers in this space? People with whom you work in kind of analogous fields, or as Steve mentioned, that there's so much spillover and that democracy affects so many issues. You don't get, for instance, immigration reform handled without democratic processes functioning. So does anyone want to, Anne, Steve, Joe, anyone want to talk about that advice for nonprofit leaders and fundraisers?
I mean, you know, one thing that I would just say is for a lot of nonprofits and advocacy organizations, there's a tendency to play in one lane or the other, right? You tend to figure out you're just going to stay in the 527 super PAC space and get candidates elected, or you're just going to do C3 advocacy campaigns. I think there's a much more powerful effect that you can have when you're able to play across all those fields, and which is very daunting because there's so many different legal rules and so many organizations just throw up their hands and like, I don't want to deal with it. But I think that the ancillary benefit of having organizations engage in all those different fields and not being afraid to open up a C4 or not being afraid to participate in a 527 PAC is that you also educate donors and funders as well, and are able to tell a story about why all these different pieces fit together in a way that actually makes the kind of change that we want to see. And so I feel like long-term, I think that is something that I think would be incredibly helpful for the democracy philanthropy space, is to get more donors, institutions, individuals more comfortable with this interplay between 501c3s, 501c4s, and 527s and PACs. And if we can do that, we can overcome some of the fragmentation that I think that I had mentioned earlier as a big obstacle.
And do you have specific advice on how to bridge those gaps, and how fundraisers can think about that, or also how they can present it to their audiences?
Yeah, I would say, of course, you know, fundraisers and executive directors are incentivized to present our work in ways that convey impact, right? And often quick impact. We're offered the opportunity to apply for a 2-year grant or a 1-year grant and show what we're going to accomplish in that time frame. But I think the more of us leaders and fundraisers in this field who can keep hitting the themes that we've already discussed on this call about educating the donors of the complexity, the timeline, that there, of course, there are urgent needs, but there's also decades-long work to do. And just that candor, I think, will serve the donor community in the long run much better than the continual hamster wheel of trying to get the quick impact sort of stories out there. It is a dance, but it's an important one that we keep that honesty and candor forefront for the community, so that our donors don't get discouraged when they don't see really obvious quick wins in short time frames.
What do you think, Joe? You're muted. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I would agree with everything that certainly Anne was just saying. I think at the end of the day, what donors need to hear is not what they necessarily just what they want to hear, right? What they need to hear is what they need to hear, right? They need to understand what are going to be solutions that will scale and that will make an actual impact. And I think what I try to encourage grantees to do is to be frank and honest about what it's really going to take. And there are always going to be some donors that can't hear that, but it's a big space, and there are a lot of folks, I think, who are really authentically trying to figure out how their resources can make an impact. And I think you are the expert, you are the guide who are helping us make our way through the space. And I think being as frank with us as you can about what you really need to move the needle, what it's really going to take. I think that's what folks need to hear.
I wonder if any of you have any examples from your own organizations and your own work of where you've encountered these kinds of dilemmas and been successful, and or maybe not successful, but maybe you want to focus on the success stories of how your organizations are tackling these kinds of challenges, because it's such a democracy. As Joe suggested, it's a big abstract topic in a way, but then when you concretize it, it's very powerful and impactful. Has anyone got anything from their own work they want to mention?
I mean, Issue One just did a phenomenal job going into the 2020 election to really raise the alarm about some of the threats that we were facing. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, for those on the call who don't know, Issue One is a bipartisan, cross-partisan organization, and we did a big campaign in the fall of 2020 to sort of to counter the narrative that there would be fraud throughout the election, and that we needed to have sort of a national feeling of patience and calm, and that the system does work, and that we can trust our systems, and therefore that the results would be legitimate. And we were able to do that because we bring Republicans and Democrats together, and we formed a National Council on Election Integrity, half Republican, half Democrat, to essentially do an enormous public media campaign sending this message, both targeting the grass tops, but also the national public, just to understand that the system works. And we didn't explicitly say we're out here to counter the big lie or the fraud narrative, but that's exactly what we were trying to do. And it was very effective, again, because we had real, true Republicans on board with us sending that message out. So it was a credible, cross-partisan, patriotic message that we could send to the country, and was very effective. We raised $15 million to do that campaign.
Congratulations, that sounds great.
Yeah, I mean, I think 2020 is just, there's a remarkable set of stories of how this broader field stood up to an incredible array of challenges. And that is across the board, whether it was related to, suddenly we had to figure out how to run an election in a pandemic. And we had to worry about, will we have enough poll workers? And a remarkable campaign got pulled together that donors then came behind, called Power the Polls, right? Which recruited hundreds of thousands of poll workers to make sure the volunteers were there to run this election. right? There was a remarkable effort to support election administrators to have to change their entire systems around in order to be able to run an election based on vote by mail that they had never done before. There was a remarkable effort to create higher participation and more diverse participation in the election. So like, I think we have seen this field stand up and do amazing things. And, you know, despite all of the fears and challenges that we're all living with, I think we can see 2020 as a real success for this field, that kind of grantees and donors stood up, and now we need to do so again, right?
I would just share, I think one of the just building off that, I think one of the real success stories has been donors' ability to find community, to find other folks, and to act in a collective fashion. And you know, that's one piece of that's one recommendation that I would give to donors, right? Find a community, because I think the scale of democracy challenges can feel so overwhelming and complex. Being able to find a community of donors who are like-minded, who can figure out how to engage together, whether it's One for Democracy, or whether it's Democracy Fund, or Way to Win, or Unite America, or the Movement Voter Project, finding a way to engage with other donors to scale and share ideas, I think is really powerful. I think from a very sort of like impact focused perspective, right? We had one donor come in and say, look, I got $100,000 I want to put on the table to support Black voters. And then other people said, wow, I'm excited about that. And then by working with a community, they were able to scale that $100,000 investment into a $1 million funding initiative, right? And so being able to scale that in that way, I think ideally gets democracy donors in the habit of giving and giving more. But, you know, as an old community organizer, I also believe deeply in the power of the collective and community. And I've seen how these donor organizing networks and these communities have inspired folks collectively during exciting times, and also help keep spirits up when things are really hard and really difficult. So I feel like that's one thing that I think, you know, we can talk about fragmentation of the space and all that stuff, but overall, I think it is a very positive development that folks are finding community with each other around democracy support and democracy donor giving. So I think that's one success story that I'd share.
I just want to add to that quickly, if I may, about this notion of donor community providing support for each other, because one thing we haven't talked about explicitly is that the politics around a lot of the work we do can be incredibly discouraging. You know, the Senate and the Congress are really gridlocked, really broken. And a lot of donors, it's yet another reason they might feel discouraged from entering this field. But the argument that sitting on the sidelines is a non-option is one that we all need to keep making. But I think the donor community and donors talking to each other and supporting each other, just like those of us who are working in the sector supporting each other in the face of these challenging politics, is just important human work that needs to happen to keep, for all of us to keep doing this work.
And there's a role to play here. It's also about kind of bringing joy to our politics, right? Like one of my favorite grantees in the last cycle was a group called Pizza to the Polls, which, you know, the name said it, right? They, you know, people are waiting in line, these long hour-long lines to vote. And they, you know, whenever there was a line, they would send out a truck with pizzas and give people something to eat, and, you know, bring dancers and bring song and bring music, you know, like, I think there is something about the celebration of the civic participation that gets lost in the doomsday scenario planning about our politics, right?
Yeah, with all our polarization and fragmentation, if we can't still agree on pizza, I think we're really in trouble in our country and our democracy. And this actually leads very neatly into one of the questions we have from the audience, which is something that's been brought up, and maybe we can get into this in a little more depth. Are donors hesitant to give when it will be perceived to be partisan? And are there ways to give in a cross-partisan, non-partisan way that can help save and protect democracy?
Yeah, I mean, so donors are very different. Some are and some aren't, but there is a very robust space of grantees that are doing deeply important non and bipartisan work in this space, whether it is the work that Alexandra was talking about for the Center for Democracy and Technology, right? Election security work should not be a partisan affair. A lot of civic education, supporting journalism, like these are things that it's hard to argue should be a partisan fight. And even questions of voting rights, right? Like everyone should have the ability to vote and do so in an easy and convenient way. Like these should not be nonpartisan fights. And I think groups like Issue One have done a great job kind of breaking out what is a bipartisan space in a very partisan environment. Right?
Anne or Steve, do you have thoughts on that? Bipartisan, cross-partisan, certainly, and your organization is explicitly designed that way.
Yeah, it's what Joe said. I mean, we actually benefit from the dollars and investment of some individuals who are extremely progressive, and on the left, we don't have a terribly large number of conservative or Republican donors, but we do have we do have some. But the point is that, yes, of course, what Joe says, so many of these issues ought to be and are by definition nonpartisan, or in fact have the agreement of the vast majority of Americans support many of the solutions and fixes that we work on, that our field collectively works on. And they're just, candidly, they're not that controversial outside of politics. We take all kinds, we benefit from the support of all kinds of donors, but different donors do have different preferences in this regard, yes.
Yeah, and we have co-funded with the Charles Koch Foundation, right, on questions of the First Amendment and free expression. Like, there's a lot of room in this space for different kinds of donors.
And I would just add, I think this very question is something that we've got to tackle, because I think, as a lot of us saw during the FTVA Act, the debate around that particular piece of legislation, there was a real lack of willingness from a lot of external stakeholders to engage, and they said, "Well, this is partisan, right?" And it's not, right? But as other folks have mentioned, democracy and protecting democracy rights and expanding democracy should be an American project, not a partisan project. And so I think it's for folks who do not see expanding democracy as their goal, and there are folks out there, they've done a good job in casting it as a partisan light. And I think we've got to figure out how to stand up and really give credence to some of the forces that are out there that are making that argument, particularly from the Republican side, right? If I'm gonna wade into those waters, I think it's important for us to figure out how to stand up and support Republicans who are saying, no, this is not a partisan thing. Yes, I support protecting voting rights and taking the flack that comes along with it. So that's just what I would say.
Great, thank you so much. So we've got about 15 minutes left, and we have several questions from the audience. So I'm just going to go through some of them, and if anyone has particular reactions to the question, just if you can briefly share some thoughts on them. And so the first one involves the education of donors, and you've mentioned that many of you find that donors are open to and interested in learning about more. But what are ways that you can approach them to make them even more open and receptive to the messages you have for them? Any thoughts on that?
I think it's what Stephen alluded to, which is almost every issue that a donor or philanthropist cares about won't see progress unless our democracy and our government is functioning and our Congress is functioning. And that's a very powerful argument for most, because most philanthropists who've been giving for a long time have seen their issue come up against sort of the gridlock or the dysfunction in Congress and in politics. So most people have experienced that firsthand with their philanthropic strategies.
Yeah, I mean, I would just repeat what I said earlier, which is, I think donors need to understand how supporting, whether it's something on voting rights or civic education or something else, how it's going to make a difference. They need to understand what that impact looks like, even if it's going to take a while, or if it involves contributions that others are going to be making. They just need to understand the through line between the dollars that they're committing and where that's going to go and how that's going to make a difference. Right?
Yeah, and I mean, I think this is one of the key things that we are really thinking about at One for Democracy, because as I mentioned earlier, democracy donors follow a boom bust cycle. They focus their giving just simply through an electoral lens. So it's like they think if the Democrats don't keep the House, then we failed. And it's like, we got to get people away from that sort of thinking and get people to really engage and think about what's really impactful, right? Sometimes state and local work is often much more impactful and can have a huge difference, but that's not where the majority of checks go. They go to the DCCC or the DSCC. So, and I think this is an issue that we're really delving into. We're trying to stand up some democracy donor 101 curriculums to say, here's how you can actually be an impactful democracy donor. And these are the kinds of giving practices that are most helpful to the field. So I think this is definitely a challenge that we are looking to address. And I think as a field, we've got to do a better job about it.
Well, thank you. And so another question from our audience is, what can everyday donors do to contribute? Those of us who are not billionaires.
Yeah, I think there's a lot that folks can do, right? You can volunteer to be a poll worker. You can volunteer to be an election judge. You can knock on doors and make phone calls to get folks involved. You can combat misinformation in your churches and your schools. You can encourage your company to give, election day off for its employees and to do join the Civic Alliance, which is a remarkable collaboration of private sector brands and companies who are trying to step up and strengthen democracy. You can reach out to folks in your family, in your friend networks who have been kind of wrestling with misinformation and help them work their way through. Like, these are all kinds of things that they don't change the world, but none of this there are no individual acts that are going to change everything, right? It's got to aggregate up. And I think there are lots of things that we can all do to play a role. And you can also write checks, right? There are lots of local groups in your communities that are doing thankless, tireless work that need to be supported. And there are lots of local officials who are, withstanding death threats just to do their job. Like, say thank you. Support your local election clerk and election official. Like that is a remarkably powerful thing to do, because these people are the folks who are the champions of our democracy, and they need your support.
And I've just, I think aggregating up, that's something that Joe mentioned, absolutely critical, right? Like I said, find a community, find folks that you can engage with so that your $50,000 check can get aggregated with another person's $100,000 check and get aggregated, and you can have collective impact. I think whether it's One for Democracy or the Democracy Funders Network or Way to Win or Movement Voter Project, there are these donor communities out there, these donor organizing networks that I think, as I mentioned earlier, can get people to really amplify their impact exponentially in some cases, but also find that community where you're feeling like you're part of this community, and it's able to make sure that you keep on being sustained as a democracy activist and supporter over the long term.
Well, our audience has another question related to this, and what do you say to people who've lost faith in our democratic process and in these structures in the US? And that could be around an issue maybe like transparency in elections or possibly something else. And how do you engage those folks?
Yeah, I don't think we have to be Pollyannish in order to not give up hope, right? Like, I think it's possible to be real about some of the threats and challenges that are in front of our country and our system without kind of giving up hope. I think we can recognize that there's never been this kind of golden period of democracy where everything just worked and we were truly of, by, and for the people. right? Across the last 250 years, we've seen a lot of really, really hard times. We've seen long periods where vast majorities of this country couldn't vote, right? So, I think it's easy to get disillusioned by things. But I think when you look at the vast kind of the span of history, yeah, this is a hard period, but we've been through a lot of hard periods. And the good news is there are a lot of allies out there, a lot of people who care and are rolling up their sleeves and doing something. And I think the best way to get more hopeful is by doing some of the work and joining them and being part of the fight. So that'd be my view.
Yeah, and I would also, I think it's important to connect up democracy to the issues that people care about. When I do talk to those people, and I have talked to those people who say, a pox on both these houses, or our democratic system is broken, I don't care about, I'm just going to talk about climate change or whatnot. And then, I think pointing out again the centrality of our democracy, of our electoral system to actually achieving the kinds of change possible, and pointing out examples where change, is really driven by people participating and engaging in our democracy in a way that results in the kinds of policy change that we want to see happen. I think by flipping into that and engaging people and saying, what issues do you care about? How can we make real progress on these particular issues, and tying and pointing out to that the importance of democracy in achieving those policy goals? I think that's something that I would use when talking to those folks, and something I've done in the past.
I would say too that in response to disillusionment, there's also ought to be, I think, for anybody who's really paying attention, sort of a sense of fear of losing our country, about the moment that we're in. I mean, we have, I think, I would assume, sort of historic levels right now of people who do not trust the results of our elections. And if we have a citizenry that doesn't believe in the result and that our elections are not legitimate, then we do not have our democracy. And so that piece, I think, is a real crisis of persuading people that we've got to shore up this fundamental piece that's the pillar, or one of the main pillars of the system. So to become disillusioned and then therefore to step away just feels to me like not an option, given the grave moment that we're in right now.
And real briefly, I think the flip side of that is to say, okay, well, why are you disillusioned? A lot of times because they're frustrated with the filibuster, or they think that gerrymandering is happening. And I think one of the things that we as a field need to do better is say, let's actually talk about what a strong and functioning, healthy American democracy could and should look like. Like, let's talk about the long term here. And, could we envision a system by which, we're making the kinds of structural reforms and the changes that actually look like a strong and healthy functioning democracy, and getting people excited about that, right? And saying, okay, so I think that's something that we as a field, I think, need to do better and say, this is where we could be going. This is the kind of system we could have. Now let's work together to actually make that happen, right? So I think, not only responding to the fear aspect, but also tapping into people's hope and inspiration and a future vision that could be really exciting and inspiring for them as well.
Well, a hopeful note is always a good place to bring an event towards its conclusion. But before we do conclude, we have a few more minutes. I just want to ask each of you, in a sentence or two, or just briefly, what's the biggest takeaway you'd want to leave with us today regarding these issues around philanthropy and the protection and promotion of democracy in the United States?
I would just say that I hope that the issue of democracy is and becomes a passion of most Americans and most every donor in the country. We need a strong pro-democracy movement in this country, and we need all hands on deck right now. And so for it to become a real movement and a real passion, and to think of it that way, and not in sort of many of the technical ways in which those of us who do this work every day think about it, but sort of energizing emotion and patriotism around shoring up the democracy is something I hope that we all, leaders in the field and donors, do together, is inspiring that movement and that growth of a movement.
Joanne, Joe or Steve? Biggest takeaway from today's event?
Yeah, look, I mean, I guess my message to folks, right, is, you know, this is a marathon, not a sprint. We're all living through a difficult, traumatic period on so many different levels, and you know, I think we all just need to take care of ourselves and take care of each other as we look to these fights. And I think, you know, we need to, when we have the resources and we have the capacity to contribute, I think everyone needs to do what they can and be part of the solution. And I think we also all need to give ourselves and each other a bit of grace as we kind of make our way through these really challenging and in some ways unprecedented times, right?
Yeah, and I would just note that we are in a moment now of unprecedented challenge where the very foundations of democracy are under attack in ways that we might not have envisioned before, and that is a reality, and it's deeply concerning. And it's, you know, it is a fight that can feel like you are pushing the boulder up the hill. But I also think that this is, while it is a moment of great challenge, it's also a moment of great opportunity where we are seeing really interesting, exciting innovations in the space, people thinking about really creative ways to engage, people who are rising to the moments and thinking about how do we meet these incredible challenges with new kinds of innovations, whether it's thinking about different policy reform or thinking about legislation, or you know, starting up new media outlets that are out there to challenge some of the, you know, the very unhelpful mis and disinformation out there, or whether it's different ways in which grassroots organizations are engaging with technology. I just think that there's a lot of innovation and new ideas in the space as well that's also really interesting. And I would encourage people, right? Now is not the time to be disillusioned, but now is the time to potentially be inspired and excited by some of these developments that are happening in the field and in the movement. And, you know, I feel like it's a moment to say, okay, let's all throw in together and figure out how we're going to fix this and rise to the moment. So.
Well, thanks very much to your time, and thank you for your insights here. We had more questions from the audience than we could possibly have fielded, because these are huge, pressing, complex, but incredibly important issues. I've spent a little time on your websites and just seeing the work that you do, and I hope that those in the audience will take some time. Anne's organization is Issue 1. Joe is with Democracy Fund. Steve is with One for Democracy, and also remember, Alexandra is with the Center for Democracy and Technology. And so, you know, really much more food for thought there as well. And so, Michelle or Bianca, is there anything further, or should we bring this to a conclusion for today?
Hi, Ray. Thanks so much. And thank you again to all of our great panelists for your insights and experience today. As I put in the chat, we'll be sending out a follow-up message shortly with information about future programming, links to the organizations of today's speakers, and a link to the video from today's event. So please do reach out with any additional questions. This is the first in our series of events this semester with Apereo Philanthropy. So we encourage you to take a look at our Eventbrite page and sign up for the remaining events. And thank you again. I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your day, and thank you for all your important work.